Down 10.
Welcome and good afternoon. This is a special meeting of the Brisbane City Council, January 20, 2026. Could you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, City Clerk, we have a request under item A, which is to consider a request of a City Council member to attend the meeting remotely under the emergency circumstances of AB 2449.
No requests were made, Madam Mayor, but I'll go ahead and do the roll call. Councilmember Davis.
Here.
Councilmember Kern.
Here.
Councilmember Lentz.
Here.
Councilmember O'Connell.
Here.
And Mayor Mackin.
Here. And can I get a first and second to adopt the agenda as it stands?
So moved.
Second. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Davis.
Aye.
Councilmember Kern.
Aye.
Councilmember Lentz.
Aye.
Councilmember O'Connell.
Aye.
And Mayor Mackin.
Aye. And we move to oral communications number 1. Is there any member of the public here today or online who wishes to make a comment, any item that is not on today's agenda? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to our workshop. Our workshop is regarding development-related infrastructure financing tools. And I do have a question before we go on, just a little kind of stage setting. So if our city manager noted we have 3 consultants, could give us just a little background how we actually engaged the 3 consultants. Was it from the city? Was it from the developer? And also, is the presentation going to be divided per consultant?
I'll start with the second first. No, I believe Eileen's going to take the majority of the presentation today on behalf of the consulting team, although both of the other consultants, Sarah and Marty, have joined us. They're online. Please ask questions. You may be able to speak to some of the more specifics to the relationship. The city has an existing relationship with Mr. Johnston, so we've utilized him in the past. And maybe as part of your presentation, you want to come up?
Okay. And question, having looked through the staff report extensively before the meeting, and a question for my colleagues. I don't know, I'd kind of like for you to weigh in whether you would want to ask questions during the presentation, with caution that we could be here very late if you do that, because this is an extensive presentation. Or if you wanted to hold questions to the end, but they might lose their relevance if we do that. Councilmember Lentz.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. You know, I do have a lot of questions.
Yes?
So, but I'm okay with maybe, I'm okay doing it at the end, or if we wanted to break it up between the various finance districts.
Okay. Okay. Councilmember Davis?
I can wait.
Okay.
Can wait till the end.
Happy to wait.
Okay. Very good. Let's move on to the presentation.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and council members. I'm Eileen Gallagher with the firm of Stiefel. We're a bond underwriting firm. To answer your question about our role with the city, we have no formal role with the city at this point in time. And we've been informally having conversations with the city since about 2018, just following the project in the news and knowing it's coming, and just kind of offering some ideas and suggestions on different financing tools that the city could consider. When we do get hired, we get hired by the city. We work for the issuer when we underwrite bonds. You'll see when my presentation starts out in the back, there's a disclaimer and a disclosure that our role as a municipal underwriter, we are providing general and factual information to you. We are not giving you advice. Your relationship with Marty and his firm is a fiduciary relationship where he does provide advice to the city. We are a market maker where we are obligated by the SEC rules to be fair to issuers and to be fair to investors both. So we are by design a middle person and don't have a fiduciary duty to the city. So that's the essence of our disclosure, and just to be upfront about that. So we are just here to provide information. We do that a lot for different issuers around the Bay Area. Is part of what we do in terms of educating and providing information. NBS, I believe, is in a similar circumstance that they may have been engaged on prior projects for the city, but I believe they are in a similar relationship. The city is now doing this as kind of a courtesy. Okay, to get started, just to give you a little bit of introductions here, if you want to flip to the introductions page, I'll walk through a couple of these financing tools. I've included a number of case studies just to give you a flavor of these financing tools. But I'll start with introducing myself and the team to you. So again, Eileen Gallagher. My firm, Stifel, is the most active underwriter of municipal bonds in California. We have a national footprint, but in California I work primarily in California, and it's a little bit of a specialized market. Our role on a transaction is to help make the financing essentially and help structure the financing, look at the range of options and tools, provide financial analysis, help the city come to a decision on whether to proceed on a given financing. Once we have a financing ready, we bring it to market. My colleagues will set prices for a bond financing, and then we have a sales force that sells those bonds to investors, and then typically make a market in the security afterwards for folks that later on down the line want to redeem their bonds or sell out to liquidate their holdings for some reason. Just to go quick on behalf of Sarah and Marty, I'll just give a quick color and they can jump in if they want to add. But Sarah works for NBS, and their role is to help form a district when there's a district formation, and then to help administer that over time. And they have a large experience footprint here in California as well. And then Marty, we worked with, I think, with the city here for a long time, and his role again is as a municipal advisor to give advice to the city on any given financing option.
Yeah, Eileen?
Yep.
I just jump in for a second.
Sure.
So for the record, Marty Johnson with J&A Consulting Group. And just to follow up on what Eileen said, we do work for the city as your municipal advisor. I've been working with the city, it's almost 25 years now at this point. And we work solely for you. As Eileen said, we have a fiduciary duty to the city. Our job is to look out and make sure that your interests are taken care of, that you're covered, that the pricing that Eileen's firm will be doing is fair based on the market at the time. Our sole allegiance is to the city. And so again, we do have a contractual relationship with the city, but at this particular point in time, we're just doing this as a courtesy. We aren't charging any fee for the discussion that we're going to be having today.
And just real quickly to jump in on NBS, we're sitting in a similar position. We are also registered municipal advisors, though Marty is leading that effort. But we have worked with the city in the past and are preparing for this presentation. This is a courtesy to you. And we also are focused on working for public agencies and not for developers.
Okay, moving on, next page. So I'm not here to tell you what the Baylands project is. Obviously, you know that much better than I do, but we understand that there's a significant infrastructure cost, in terms of getting the project going, and there'll be significant roads and water and sewer and other infrastructure needs. So my focus is really, and our team's focus is to talk about the financing tools to help fund the infrastructure, public infrastructure. You may be asked to address this in the context of the development agreement. I'm not here to talk about that at all. We're here just as an educational opportunity to so you know what these tools are as and when you may be asked to consider them. So moving on to the next, one more page. Next page. There we go. So just to start, just basic bond infrastructure financing. There's a wide range of tools that different cities and counties and school districts use to finance infrastructure, ranging from a general obligation bond where the electorate will vote for it, and that typically has the strongest credit quality and the highest ratings and the lowest interest rates. Then there are more specific enterprise revenue bonds, which are things like a water system may issue debt to fund water infrastructure, et cetera. The city has the ability to do its own lease debt. But really what I'm here to focus on are the two tools that are most often used for development-related projects, and those are tax increment and special tax or special assessment finance. And this is just a little bit of a summary. I'm going to kind of skip around, but this gives us some layout on the range of tools and the approval considerations, but I'll kind of flip forward. If you want to flip to the next page, please. So just a very high level of those two major development-related financing tools we're going to focus on. The first is the Mello-Roos Community Facilities Act of 1982, adopted in the wake of Proposition 13 to give public agencies a way of funding this kind of infrastructure. It requires a public agency to form a community facilities district, and that property owners within that district then vote to approve the levy of a special tax to fund specified eligible facilities under a specified tax formula. Those special taxes then, once they're approved, can be leveraged through the bond sale. So CFDs are typically used because they're often non-recourse tax-exempt debt as a source for funding infrastructure. So usually the tax-exempt interest rates on these financings it's a much more advantageous interest rate than a developer can access in the private capital markets typically. These bonds are usually used to acquire completed infrastructure. So this is not typically considered a construction source for developers. Usually the developer puts in whatever they're obligated to put in under the development agreement, and this is really a source of takeout financing that runs with the property. It's not on their balance sheet. It goes with the property, and the obligation to pay is specific to the property owner, not to an individual. They are historically used as tools since the 80s when the tool was first created. You know, a lot of the issuance early on was for suburban greenfield development, the Central Valley, the Inland Empire, very widely used tools throughout there for sort of typical residential subdivision. Increasingly, we see this tool used in urban infill settings, for commercial projects, for industrial projects, and just other more distinctive financing types. The Infrastructure Financing District is a tool that has been on the books since the 1990s. It was only ever used for Legoland in the San Diego area in the 90s, but then was reinvigorated after the dissolution of California redevelopment agencies. And this is a similar idea that a district is created to facilitate redevelopment, and then a portion of the sponsoring entity's share of property tax revenues could be dedicated to that district. This has been used to some extent. It's not like old redevelopment for a number of reasons. It's a much smaller revenue stream. Only the participating entity's share can be dedicated to an infrastructure financing district. So unlike redevelopment, where all of the 1% property tax could be redirected on incremental growth. So it's a much narrower revenue streams, and so it tends to be used in combination with other tools, less as a standalone financing tool. Why are IFDs used? The key point with an IFD is it's not new revenue. It's the city has a share of the property tax rate, and that whether there's growth, when there's growth, you get some portion of that through the property tax revenues off that incremental growth. So it's not creating a new revenue stream, but it is dedicating a revenue stream to a particular purpose. So it's often used when there's a big project that a community wants to happen, and it helps create some incentive for that. Sort of the concept of growing the pie and making it, making more revenue for everybody, all the taxing entities. And then also it can be used as a source of funds for affordable housing. And so we've seen that in some cases where that's part of the incentive. Moving on, I want to flip forward 2 pages. Yes, thank you. So just to go a little deeper on a CFD. So, and I'm focusing this presentation on CFDs, Community Facilities District, not assessment districts. Assessment districts are a similar tool. It's an older tool. It's actually less flexible and is more prone to litigation. So for the most part, for this kind of project we're talking about here, the vast majority are done using a CFD, not an assessment district. And I'll leave it there for now. If you want, I can go further, but that's probably the key point. But with a CFD, the boundaries of the district can be tailored to the project needs, to the project support. And there can be one CFD used for a project or multiple CFDs. There's different ways of configuring these. Within the district, the threshold for approval is 2/3. So it's, but again, typically that's the property owners are the entities that are voting up front. And so that they're usually part of the conversation. It's rare that an issuer tries to jam a CFD onto property owners. Usually it's a conversation and a negotiation in terms of the terms and the metrics, because it's a pretty high voter threshold to approve them. The special taxes, there's a tax formula that's prepared that designs how the taxes are spread among property uses in the district. And it could be residential property could have a different rate than commercial, or the variance could be by the size of a home or the size of a multifamily unit versus a for sale unit. There's lots of ways of kind of carving up the special tax revenues. It just has to be reasonable. And so again, that's a pretty detailed, thoughtful part of the input of the work of creating a district, is how to spread those taxes. The vote is by the property owner unless there are at least 12 registered voters in the district, and then in that case, it's by the electorate. So we do sometimes see electorate votes, but it's usually these are done before there are residential residents in a district. The key point of a CFD, and the reason why this tool is used for development projects and is used relatively early in the development cycle, is because the issuer, when it creates a district and issues debt, makes a promise to investors to foreclose on delinquent parcels. So if a property isn't making its tax payments in a timely way, the city is obligated to pursue accelerated foreclosure. So in a normal instance, property taxes, if you haven't paid your property taxes for 5 years, there'd be a foreclosure action. This is an accelerated process. So if there's a significant delinquencies, you're obligated to pursue them quickly outside of de minimis exceptions. And that's why this tool is called land secured finance, because the property becomes essentially the collateral for the borrowing. And that's why investors are comfortable with this financing tool and are willing to lend significant amounts of money on an early stage basis to these projects. So considerations, these tools, again, they're used often early stage in the process at times. The credit quality, they're usually sold as non-rated bonds, so they're not based on the city's rating. They are based on the credit quality of the specific district at that time, and because until there's significant development, they're often just done without a rating, and that's accepted by the investor community. So the way we typically look at credit is, what's going on with it? It's the story. What's going on with the project? Who's developing it? How far along into the project are they? What kind of momentum is there? How attractive is the location and the economy within which this project is occurring? And then we look at the value of the property relative to the debt, because again, that's the collateral. So the value to lien, you'll hear that term used in the context of this tool a lot, and that's the value of the property relative to the debt. The rule of thumb is at least a 3-to-1 value to lien for any kind of public bond sale. And then the extent of leverage is also a consideration. So I'll go into some examples, but that's kind of high level. You can see a little picture there of Bay Meadows. That's down in San Mateo, a example of an infill project in some ways similar to Baylands, which this tool has been used, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Next page. This is just a laundry list of what CFD special taxes can finance. They can finance capital, facilities, kind of all the basics, roads and streets and water, sewer, the parks, etc. The key things are the facilities that are financed need to have a useful life at least as long as the bond issuance. So if you have a 5-year useful life, you can't issue 30-year bonds against that. It's usually the bonds are based on the useful life of the assets. And the capital projects must be owned by a public entity. So we're talking about projects that the city is going to acquire, the school district is going to acquire, an overlapping jurisdiction that's responsibility for, water, sewer, et cetera, would be acquiring. that's what we're talking about in terms of capital projects that are financed for the most part. The other thing CFDs can finance are services, and those are not to replace existing sources of service funding. Those are for incremental services. So if you'll need to expand, landscaping work or maintenance work or police services to serve a new development project, that's what can be financed through the CFD services tax. Though the determination of what's related to that project is often determined through a fiscal impact study, sort of assessing that up front. Next page. So this is just a very high-level summary of what's involved in forming a district. The district, there's two steps that I think of it: the district formation, where the district is formed, and then the bond issuance. The bond issuance can happen months later, years later. They're not necessarily moving at the same time. The district is usually formed upfront. It has to be formed upfront. And that the first key thing is who's going to form it. Is it the city? Is it the county? Is it a special other public agency? For the in general, the bonds, whoever forms the district, their name is going to be on the official statement, the security offering that goes out into the market. So while the city would have no obligation to make payments on a special tax bond, its name is on it. So there's some scrutiny in terms of comfort level with what's being financed. And then within that is, at least half of the proceeds would be owned by the sponsoring public agency. So most often we see the relevant city or relevant county as the issuer. We see school districts doing some for school facilities, obviously. There are third-party joint powers authority that are statewide that do function in that role in some cases as well. But again, creating the district, the key inputs to that are the list of what facilities can be financed, and then the way the tax is going to roll out, who's going to get taxed first, in what maximum amounts, and how those taxes going to vary by the nature of the land uses or the unit size or whatever other metric is incorporated into that special tax formula. Then there's a public process, notice of an intention to form a district, and then a public hearing, and then approval process. So it's like a three-step legislative process to forming it. And then the bonds can be issued anytime thereafter. Often they lag. Usually the district's formed up front, and then the bond timing is based on the project readiness, but also on the reimbursement readiness. So if the bonds are being issued to acquire completed facilities, it depends in part on the timing of those completed facilities. The bonds are often issued in phases. So it's not one giant financing that you're financing everything up front. You're often financing phase one and then coming back and doing phase two. And again, those details vary by each project on the circumstances of the project, but that's pretty typical. Next page. So the security for the bonds is the annual tax that's levied against the property in the district. And then in the event of delinquent payments on the value of the land that would be subject to a foreclosure sale. And that, again, that's why we talk about that. Like other property taxes, if there's delinquencies, there's the typical late payments, 10% penalties, and et cetera, that accrue over time. Again, that foreclosure covenant I mentioned is the key element that makes these bonds as marketable as they are. And then when we do a large financings for a large project, we're often expecting to have multiple series. So we're looking at, the facts and circumstances under which additional debt can be issued for the same district. Once the bonds are issued, then there's usually a disclosure obligation back to the market. So when the bonds are sold the first time, there's a very developed securities offering that describes the city and the project and the risks and all of the details. But because those bonds are long-lived assets, the market demands updated information. So usually the city has an obligation at least once a year to report, have the taxes been collected? Are there any delinquencies? What's happening with the big picture of the taxes? And then often the developer for an early stage project is obligated to provide at least annual, in many cases semi-annual disclosure to the market about the development work that's going on, because the value of those bonds is going to change materially based on what's happening with the project itself on which is being taxed. Next page. So a big question we get from both developers and cities is, gosh, how much can you finance through a land secured CFD? And that depends on two different categories of information. First is when you're forming a district up front, you're setting maximum parameters. So you're saying the maximum amount of debt that can ever be issued for this district is, and you're setting that in a resolution and approving that. And then you're also defining what facilities are eligible to be financed, and then you're also setting the maximum tax that can be levied, often with an escalator. What's typical is there's a maximum special tax rate, then it usually escalates at 2% per year. So those three things provide a constraint, on a mathematical constraint on what can be ever issued. And then the other variant is sort of what happens at the time the bonds are actually ready to be sold, and that can be affected by the development momentum at the time, market conditions, what are interest rates like, and variety of things that are time sensitive and are going to change in a dynamic market. The next page. So when a bond district is formed and the bond issuance is sort of ripe for a bond issuance, that's where the city gets involved in helping prepare that offering circular that I mentioned, and preparing to enter the marketplace. Who buys municipal land secured bonds? It's the audience of investors that buys any kind of municipal bonds, but a little bit smaller. So among all the people that are looking for fixed income investments, there's a little bit narrower of an audience that will participate in a non-rated land secured market, but it's a pretty well-developed market. There's about 20 institutions that participate in California in the marketplace, of which 3 to 5 institutions we consider kind of anchor institutions. They participate in many, if not most, financings, whereas the balance of the 20 it's going to be really dependent on what's happening in market conditions. Also, individuals. There's a very developed network of individual investors that understand this credit, that like the fact that it's secured by real estate value, and have been buying these kind of bonds for decades. And so they like that they're getting a little higher yield for a non-rated security, and they feel confident that they'll get paid back. And the delinquency rates are relatively low, even the fact that these are non-rated development securities in most cases. The interest rates on these bonds are going to vary based on market conditions and on credit quality of a particular security. So this little picture I like to use, in our markets, we tend to price municipal bonds relative to a benchmark index. It's a kind of a wonky index we use called the AAA Municipal Market Data Index. It's a blend of AAA credits from around the country, kind of the average yields at any given day. It's a daily index that's reset, and it's reset from a range of maturities of bonds, a 1-year bond, a 5-year bond, a 10-year bond, and kind of those interest rates vary. And you can see in the little graphic here, the dark blue, that's the sort of benchmark index yield at any given time. And then above that, there's typically a credit spread for the additional risk of a non-rated investment security. So even if the city were to issue its own debt, your rating is not a AAA, and so you'd have usually a credit spread above that index, and then the lower your rating or non-rated, the higher the spread typically tends to be above that. And those benchmarks index yields can vary based on just supply and demand. Today the markets are a little bit off because there's concern about what's happening with the geopolitical dynamic. And those things vary by day, and they vary by different market conditions. And then that credit spread is going to depend on the specifics of the project, but also again on investors' appetite for risk at any point in time. Next page. So this is really the page where we kind of cover, like, what do you need to worry about as a city council person, and what does this mean to you, and what do you have to think about as you are looking forward on this. And so here's just flagging some of the pre-formation considerations and the policy considerations that typically come up with these districts. First is just by law, you're required to have adopted local goals and policies for Mello-Roos CFD bonds. And that's a requirement just to ensure that the staff and the council have thought about this and understand kind of the range of options and have policies in place to address this. So that's something that if you haven't already adopted, you'd be asked to adopt or maybe refresh if you have older policies on the books that haven't been looked at in a while. Those generally just provide guidelines of what you can issue under what circumstances. And then you have to think about the city's team of who's involved and what resources you need to kind of understand the financing and help create the district. And usually that means you're pulling in people from the city manager's office and finance and public works and all the different parties that are kind of touching the issues related to the development. The development and titles and the financing plan are obviously a key input, and we know that's ahead of you still. And so usually the district formation sort of follows the process of once the entitlements are in place. You know, sometimes the conversations around these districts are happening in a simultaneous way, but the formation of the districts follows the entitlements, right? What are you going to build? Then we can figure out what the tax capacity might be and kind of what tax formula you want to adopt, what facilities are going to get financed, et cetera. So understanding how all those puzzle pieces fit together is an important part. And then again, the issuance, the governance and the issuance. So again, as I mentioned, typically a city or a county is forming this. You know, a city for a incorporated place, a county in an unincorporated area. School districts do it for certain school facilities. There are third-party entities that provide that service if the city isn't interested in doing it. There are some pros and cons of going that route. You kind of hand the governance to somebody else that's not necessarily looking at it as closely as you would be in your community. So that's typically, you know, most of the financings we do have the city or the county's name on the bonds, and they're in the room when these decisions are getting made. The size and the structure of the proposed district, this is something that's kind of down the line for you, but for large projects, as I mentioned, they're often kind of carved up into more bite-sized pieces. Sometimes that's a phase 1, and you come back later and do a phase 2. And the idea is it's rare in this moment in time in California that one big bond sale is going to happen for a mega project. I have some case studies we'll talk through, but for example, like San Francisco's Treasure Island project, you may be following, if every time you cross the Bray Bridge, you've seen that project evolve here in the last 5 years or so. They have a very, very large authorizations, and they've done multiple rounds of financing so far, with many more planned. But again, those tend to be smaller bite-sized financing pieces with subsequent issuances down the line as development proceeds by phase. And then the last thing is just the tax formula. I mentioned that briefly. Those are once the development entitlements are in place and there's a financing team in the room and people roll up their sleeves, there's a lot of time spent up front designing the tax formula, what kind of projects are going to get financed, and how to spread the cost of those projects among components of the development. I'm going to pause there. That's a lot. I just blew through fast. So if you want to ask questions by district type, that's kind of the end of the CFD presentation. And then I'm going to turn to the IFD presentation, and then we'll talk about case studies and examples, mostly drawn from the Bay Area.
Okay, thank you, Eileen. I'm going to suggest that instead of each member of the council asking 2, 3, 4, 5 questions, we limit it to one question, because someone else might have the same question but a little different version, and that way we can kind of dovetail off of each other in that regard. So, Councilmember Lynch, you want to start?
All right. Okay, so which one question shall I find here?
And if you want to wait till we go through both tools, that's fine too. I don't want to
Yeah, I would
prescribe.
prefer to just
Would you?
bang through
Okay,
it.
Okay.
all right.
This
Let's-
is a lot of pressure coming up with one question right now.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, you'll get a second round. You'll get a second round.
You know how I like the
Yeah.
questions.
If we can, I have a couple questions on the pages as far as terms. They said something about the city's own teeter plan. What is a teeter plan?
Sure. So the teeter plan, some counties have the teeter plan in place that they offer for jurisdictions, taxing entities within their jurisdiction and if you're participating in the teeter plan, it means when you levy a tax, you get paid 100% of that, even if there are delinquencies. So for example, there's the tax levy for a particular CFD is $5 million and 4.8 million is paid in a timely way, you would get the whole $5 million from the county, and then the county would pursue the delinquencies and get to keep the penalties on those delinquent amounts. Not every county offers the teeter plan, and not every county allows CFDs to participate in the teeter plan. But when it's offered, it's considered a credit positive by investors. So it's something when, in the specifics of it, we would be asking about that if that's available here or not.
Another on terminology, you said it's 2% max tax on homes.
Yep.
And then it's go bond overrides. What is a go bond?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's I'm sorry. I spent a lot of time talking about bonds, so I get deep in the weeds. So when we talk, I didn't go deep into the mechanics of the tax formulas, but you can see that on that page there. Yes, that the all-in tax burden, when it's designed in the tax formula, the amount you can put on the tax burden on a particular property, there are some guidelines and rules of thumb. For residential homes, it's an all-in tax rate of 2% of the expected home price, and that includes the 1% base property tax rate that is levied on all property in California, plus any overrides that may already have been approved for general obligation bonds is what GO refers to. So that's the most common override. There may be other special tax districts or broader districts if there was a, flood assessment district, or if there was a mosquito abatement district. There's all kinds of things that show up on your tax bill in addition to that 1% rate. When we look at the whole stack, within that 2%, that sort of defines how much you can kind of, allocate towards a CFD. And then for a commercial project and industrial projects, it's a little, there's not that rule of thumb of 2%. It's a little like what's market reasonable. And that's a conversation with the developers typically, because no one wants to put too much taxes on a project that they can't then develop, right? So it's always a conversation about what's appropriate. A developer may be motivated to have a higher tax to get more facilities reimbursed, but they don't want it to be so high that they can't find end users for the projects.
I was just looking for a quick description, not an in-depth description. So thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to ask a question, Ms. Mayor.
Okay. So if we could continue with the presentation.
Okay.
Thank you.
So next page, we're going to flip to infrastructure financing districts, and you can go ahead and move to the next page. So this is another tool that's used. It's also a special district that can be created in a defined geography. And within that district, a portion of the incremental property taxes can be dedicated to the district. And so just if you had, we were around when redevelopment was an active tool, the concept is similar, it just the scope is different. So when I say incremental property taxes, when a district is formed, there's an assessment on that property already, typically. In some cases, it's zero. In Treasure Island's case, it was zero because the land had been owned by the federal government until it was turned over to the city. But whatever the assessed value is at the time the district is formed becomes the base year. And so only as, if, and when assessed values grow above that base year, that's what I'm talking about, incremental value. It's the increase above the base assessment that it becomes the incremental property tax. And the 1% of property tax rate applied to that is then divided up by all the taxing entities that participated in that. So the city's share, it's only the city's share of that 1% that's arguably part of the, can be dedicated to the district, unless the county or any other taxing entity apart from schools chooses to join and participate as well. Excuse me. So it's conceptually similar to old California redevelopment in terms of credit and mechanics. It's different in that it's a smaller revenue stream. As I mentioned, it's a smaller share of the revenues stream, of the property tax revenues. Thank you. There can be other revenues that are contributed to an infrastructure financing district. Typically, we see in some cases like the motor vehicle fee in lieu tax may be contributed, but it's usually the property taxes that are the lion's share of revenue. An issuer can choose to dedicate all or some of its share of property taxes to an IFD. So we see jurisdictions that'll say, half of the growth I'll keep for the general fund and half I'll contribute to the IFD, or any variation thereof is what we see in different jurisdictions. So it's a negotiated conversation. In a place like San Francisco, part of that negotiation is what are you using the funds for, and these like prioritizing projects and things like that. This tool it's a passive revenue, meaning unlike a CFD, which is you're going to charge us the maximum tax and you're going to levy it, and if they don't pay, you're going to foreclose. That's an active tax with collateral standing behind it. This is passive. The property values can go up, property values can go down. You have no control over it. The property owners have no control over it. It's really what the assessor is doing in any given time. And obviously when there's development activity, that they usually go up, but we have points in time when the market value drops, and the assessor is obligated by law to reduce the assessed value accordingly. So that for that reason, there's usually a requirement for a coverage cushion. So we're rarely bonding 100% of the revenues. We're usually keeping a 25 to 50% cushion for variations in assessed value in the case of economic recession or property damage or whatever else. So for lots of reasons, that tool is often used in combination with other tools, less on a standalone basis. So flipping to the next page, the things to think about is, again, what the projects can be used for. They can be used for kind of a similar but slightly different list of eligible facilities as a CFD. So they're the kind of meat and potatoes are the same, but around the edges are a little bit different, what can be financed. Public facilities or projects with community-wide significance and useful life of at least 15 years. They can also be used for the acquisition, construction, or rehab of affordable housing with some requirements for the covenants that go, or the affordability covenants that go on that housing. The key point I always make with IFDs, that there's no new revenue and there's no new tax. So there's no new revenue. This is, your property tax rate exists. And if there's growth, you're going to get a portion of that growth in incremental property taxes, whether it's dedicated to an IFD or not. So there's no new revenue stream here, it's just really allocating that revenue stream. There's no new tax. So, there's no extra burden on top of what would a property owner or homeowner would be paying anyway. It's a limited revenue stream, as I've mentioned, and it's passive and it can be very volatile. And so that's, again, many of the reasons why it's used differently than CFDs. It's a little bit less efficient. Next page. So often these tools are used together in various ways. This is a very old picture of Mission Bay in San Francisco. I love this picture because it shows, if you went there today, if you drove up 280, it looks really different. But you can see the Chase Center and everything else that's there now. But in 1999, the city of San Francisco created redevelopment project areas around Mission Bay South, and they created a CFD around Mission Bay South. The CFD was used to issue bonds as early as 2001. We did multiple series of bonds for the early stage infrastructure when the district looked largely like that picture, not a lot of activity. The tax increment financing, we didn't leverage tax increment for 10 years. Again, even in an infill project in San Francisco, in what was then like one of the hottest real estate cycles in the country, if not the world, in that, the early, the 90s, 2000s run up, the tax increment is passive, it lags. So even when the home is, if you build a house, you build a building, it's not taxed for another 18 months often. And so there's not a revenue stream until after everything's completed and then shows up on the tax rolls. So for lots of reasons, the CFDs are used up first. They're the most flexible tool to use up front to kind of get things going. And then tax increment is sort of a lagging revenue, and therefore it's often a lagging bond issuance. A CFD can be issued earlier with a lower coverage ratio and typically lower interest rates. So flipping through the next page. So we use the two tools together often, not always. A lot of financings are done with just CFDs, but more often we're seeing large complicated projects use both. They can be used additively. So in San Francisco, Treasure Island's project, there's huge infrastructure needs. They had a lot of work that was done. Hundreds of millions of dollars of infrastructure went in long before there was anything vertically coming out of the ground there. And so they're using everything. They've used CFDs, they've used infrastructure financing districts. They did 3 rounds of CFD financing before they got to the first IFD financing, the tax increment financing, because it lags. So there was development, that development has to come out of the ground and start to generate revenues before those revenues can be leveraged. In other projects, in the 2 examples I use, there's a project in Sacramento called Aggie Square. It's similar to this in structure to the project Mission Rock in San Francisco that you see if you're at a Giants game, you look south, that new development where the Visa headquarters building is now, is similar, where they're netting the 2 tools against each other. So they wanted to use a infrastructure financing district just with this revenue stream and use that to fund the infrastructure. But for the reasons I've mentioned, it's hard to leverage. And so they wrapped it with a CFD. So what in Aggie Square's case, this is a UC Davis project in downtown Sacramento where they've built a lifelong learning office space on the medical school campus with the idea of bring the academy and the business incubators together to kind of create an opportunity here. And so they were going to do an infrastructure financing district, and we just kind of talked them through it and said, look, listen, if you do a CFD around it, you can issue debt sooner with a lower coverage ratio and lower interest rates. And so they sized the CFD special tax, the maximum tax that you can levy in the CFD, to be about what they expected to generate in the tax increment district. So then they say, listen, we'll tax ourselves unless or until that increment shows up. So kind of put your money where your mouth is. We think we're going to generate upside tax increment of X, so we'll put a tax on our property so we can issue debt sooner before it shows up in the tax rolls necessarily. And if it doesn't show up, or if the revenues go down, our tax, we can be taxed. So it's a way of, it's like a parent co-signing a kid's loan. It's a way of credit enhancing the tax increment tool. So pretty different than stacking the 2 together. It's netting them against each other, which has been used a couple different ways.
Feel free to use this if you need it.
Thank you. And the last variation, just I'm going to highlight, is there are times when we have both. So in Sacramento County, they have a large industrial project right near the Sacramento airport, of which there's a longstanding CFD. They created an overlapping EIFD, Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District. And when we did a financing for them in 2022, and we decided, do you want to net them against each other? Do you want to combine them? What do you want to do? And they said, well, we're not sure. We want to keep the CFD as is. We want to keep the IFD as is. And if and when we don't need the EIFD debt capacity, then we can use the money to lower the special tax levy. And so that's what they've been doing. They've kept it separate. They're not obligated to combine the 2, but they have the option to combine the 2. So that's the other variation that we see sometimes. Moving on, next page, please. So this is just an example of the projects that have used it. There are about, at least 30 infrastructure financing districts that have been adopted to date. They have different names. There's EIFD, IRFD. They're different acronym names for the same concept. Only 2 of them have done public bond sales so far, San Francisco and West Sacramento. In part, San Francisco is a city and a county, so they get a much, much, much larger share of the property tax revenues than any city does. They get 65 cents of every dollar. West Sacramento, by a function of history, gets a very large percentage too. They get something like 55 cents of every dollar. So it's a quickly embraced tool in a community like that, and so they were the kind of first out of the box to issue it. A lot of these other issuers that have adopted the tool have much lower shares of the tax revenues, but they are using it in different ways for, it's less powerful in those jurisdictions accordingly, but it is being considered in lots of places. Next page, maybe 2 pages forward, 1 more page. So case studies, there's lots of case studies around the state I could highlight, but I really wanted to focus on some of what's happening in the Bay Area, since these are projects you may be familiar with just on your commute or driving in the area. City of San Francisco has done a lot of CFD financing and tax increment financing. City of South San Francisco has a CFD for which we've done a few bond sales. City of San Mateo, Alameda, Oakland, Fremont. There's a wide range of projects that have used the CFD tool. And then, Mountain View Shoreline also has a tax increment tool that they've used before as well. So just to give you I'll go through a couple case studies just to give you some flavor of what this looks like in real life, that, when you're looking at a financing from a council perspective, what you might see. So next page, please. The first one here is the San Mateo Bay Meadows. This was the old racetrack in San Mateo. So giant infill project in a really fantastic location in the middle of the peninsula, right, where Highway 92 coming, 101, very central project, large 170-acre site, right near a Caltrain station. So the developer there had plans to build about 1,000 residential units plus office space, private high school, etc. And they created a CFD. It was originally formed in 2008. And then with the recession happening, they kind of deferred their bond sale until and ultimately amended the terms of the special tax district, and then did their first financing in 2012. So when they came to market in 2012, that was one of the first development projects that came to market using this tool post-recession. So there had been waves of issuance, and then the market was pretty challenged there for a while. So San Mateo was one of the first ones out of the box thereafter, and did really well. You can see they did 3 different financings, in part based on the timing of the projects they were acquiring from the developer. So the developer would put the infrastructure in the ground, and the city would purchase it back once the bonds had been issued and they had projects to do that with. Those bonds that were done more than a decade ago now have since been refinanced, and that's a pretty typical life cycle. So the first financings are done on a non-rated basis, where the interest rates are higher than they would if they were rated, and then you come back 10 years later, it's now a fully built out project, and we were able to refinance those bonds at a much lower interest rate. You can see here the little box on the right shows, where that you can see the assessed value, how it lags development. So you can sort of see in most cases when we're looking at what's the value of the property at the time we're issuing the bonds, we're typically using an appraisal, because typically the assessed values don't reflect what's happening in terms of the development. So the appraised values we're looking at what's the real market value, because we know assessed values don't always reflect market value. So you can see over time as development proceeded, the values went up as more development happened, and there was some sales momentum and activity, and they were able to leverage subsequent phases of the authorization for the district. Next page. So this is just down the street here, an Oyster Point. So the city of South San Francisco worked for a long time on the redevelopment of a former landfill. It was their old dump, and the redevelopment agency was active in kind of closing that and containing it. And then plans came forward later on post redevelopment for this business park, life sciences campus, and they have now completed the first 2 phases of a 4-phase project. 10 buildings planned total. The first 6 are done. And that the CFD was formed on 44 acres with a maximum bond authorization of $105 million. They set the special tax rate at $2 per square foot. It was all office space, so there was no residential property in the district. And that $2 per square foot escalates at 2% per year thereafter. In this case, because the property is being developed by a real estate entity that owns the land, owns the property, and just has developed it with triple net leases. So the real estate entity Kilroy is the taxpayer. So it's a concentrated tax ownership, but they have leased out large portions of the project so far to date. So we did the first bond sale based on the phase 1 revenues in 2022. We just did a second phase last June to leverage the tax revenues of the second phase as that phase was completed. And both of those sales went very well. Next page. This is an example, it's a little older, from Fremont, Warm Springs. So the BART, as you may know, has been extending south. They opened a BART station in Warm Springs area of Fremont a couple years ago. This is an area right north of what was then the NUMMI plant back in the day that closed. Now it's the Tesla plant. So there was a lot of interest in redeveloping that area. So they had pretty significant development plans trying to create some economic redevelopment around about 1,000 acres in the immediate vicinity of that transit station. This particular district was formed on a portion of that, the portion that Lennar was working on. At the time the district was formed, the tax was set only on for sale units. So there's some apartment units, there's some office space, but only the condominiums that were going to be developed in townhomes for sale to buyers were subject to the tax. So we did those sale. At the time we did the first bond sale, about 270 of the building permits had been pulled out of about 950 planned homes, and that sale went very well. There, the taxes were they range from about $1,000 to $2,000 per unit. That again escalates per year. Next page. So this, I mentioned San Francisco, Treasure Island. Again, if you drive across the Bay Bridge with any frequency, you've seen this come out of the ground and come to life over the last 5 or 6 years. They are redeveloping an old naval base into a new community plan for about 8,000 homes. And again, because of the very significant infrastructure needs, they are using the kitchen sink to finance it on the public side. So they have a $5 billion authorization for their CFD and about $780 million authorization for their tax increment district. The CFD has different improvement areas. So the way they've structured that CFD, it's one giant CFD, but it has really separate securities for each phase of development. We've done 4 bond sales for that CFD to date for 2 different improvement areas in total. And as more development happens, they'll be doing more improvement area formations and then ultimately bond issuances. The tax increment district was formed. Here they have the good fortune that their base year value was 0 because it was coming over from the federal government off the tax roll. So they get a large share of the property taxes. So we've done 3 rounds of tax increment financing so far for that project, raising about $60 million in tax increment and about more than $100 million for the CFD so far. And when those projects come to market, these big, high interest, high complexity projects, as a bond underwriter, we're very involved in helping tell the story and explain and figure out what's going on with the finances of the developers and the project and the timing and the construction phases. And then when we were marketing those bonds, we use drone videos and site tours and you name it to help investors understand the project and what's going on and what makes it distinctive. And that helps get these very, very early stage financings done successfully. Next page. So this is the other example I mentioned from San Francisco in the Mission Rock project that you see from the ballpark. This one where they are, again, intertwining CFDs and IFDs. They have 4 different types of tax in this district, special tax. The big one, the development tax, was based on what they expected to generate in tax increment. Again, so they expected tax increment to be able to be generated here and leveraged, but they set the special tax, this proactive active tax with collateral as in that, and that's what we've leveraged. We've leveraged the CFD tax, and then as and when the increment comes in, it's used to offset the levy. So July 1 rolls around, the city looks and says, what have I collected last year from tax increment? Okay, I'm gonna apply that to the tax levy and reduce it accordingly. So that's another way that these have been used. They've done a couple of rounds of financing to date as well, and in that case it was pretty early stage financings that they've done, and you can see the far left is what it looked like the first time we did a sale in 2021, and the pictures on the right are what it looked like when we did subsequent sales in 2023. So that's come out of the ground pretty quickly. Next page. So the last page here, maybe next page. So this last page here is just credentials for Stifel, my firm, and what our role is in the marketplace and what we do, just as an advertisement, because you gotta root for yourself here a little bit. And then the rest are more case studies and examples that if you wanted other kind of variations, you can kind of flip through and get a sense of what other projects in the Bay Area have looked like and get at least a little like teaser taste of what how those financings come together. with that, I don't know if there's questions
Yeah.
or, it's a lot.
It was a lot, but it was very thorough.
Yeah, good.
Okay. Councilmember Lentz, ready with your first question?
All right. All right, so we still under that one question rule, Madam Mayor?
Well, I want to give everybody a chance, so rather than have someone maybe take 10, 20 minutes, I think some of our questions may dovetail off what someone else asked. So let's give it a try.
Let's give it a shot. Okay. All righty. So, Eileen, thank you for the presentation. So you had mentioned that the land is the collateral. So some of these projects, one in the appendix, so if you wouldn't mind going there,
Sure.
please. You know, trying to find some similar projects to the Baylands. I mean, you're never going to find an exact fit, but of all the ones that you had presented, you know, this seems to be something that is somewhat close. You know, you have a former brownfield, and you're looking at housing and commercial, hotel, and other mixed uses. So first off, who owns this property? Is it publicly owned or privately
You
owned?
talked about Alameda?
Sorry, the Sacramento Rail Yard.
Oh, Sacramento Rail
project?
Yard, okay,
Yeah, on
yes.
page 36,
That's
sorry.
a good one,
sorry,
yep.
Sorry.
So there's brownfield remediation in many of these projects. Some of it's before we're in the room. Some of it's, you know, when we're there, we're tuned into what's happening. The rail yards is a good example. It's outside of the Bay Area, but I included it because I thought it was quite analogous. So that it was privately owned land,
Privately owned
Yep.
land, okay.
and there was extensive brownfield remediation work that was done. Some of it was done before redevelopment dissolution. So there's some of the funding for the remediation was augmented by tax increment districts from back in the day. But the developer has been completing the remediation and completing the infrastructure. They have done a CFD on the rail yards, a large chunk of it, and they have a piece that is existing in a new EIFD, and they are seeking to expand that. But it was privately owned land.
Okay, so then it says the CFD was formed in 2018.
Yes.
And then in 2022, it says inaugural bond sale. So
Yes.
they formed the CFD in 2018, but they didn't go out to the marketplace until 4 years later.
Yes, and that's not uncommon. We see that particularly for some of these larger complex projects, that partly you're creating the district and setting the tax formula and the eligible facilities while the developer owns all of the land. Subsequent to that, they started selling units. You know, you can see in this picture to some extent, there was some vertical development in place by the time we did the bond sale in 2022. Their first residential project was under construction, and there was other activity happening. And that's when I say when the bond issuance happens, when there's sort of something ripe there, that's helpful. Having a little bit of development activity and momentum is often, you know, helpful to the credit. And then it's also, I mentioned the timing issue. You'll see, like in the San Mateo example, the bond issuances were done in 3 bites, in part because the infrastructure is being put in 3 bites. And so the timing, there's no reason to get to issue the debt up front that you're not going to get reimbursed for 3 years because you're just negative carry, right? So to some extent, it's when the infrastructure that's being financed by the CFD, when is it done and eligible for reimbursement? That's often a driver of when the bond sale occurs.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it also just seems that it limits a city's liability. If you said that, you know, the land is the collateral, but if the land hasn't been cleaned up yet, I mean, I'm looking at here, it says that the brownfield remediation of site and significant infrastructure is completed.
Yeah, that was a long-running project. They did a lot of work there for a long time, but before we got to the bond issuance place. At this point, the entitlements are in place. The land is kind of ripe for development. The remediation was completed by that point.
Yeah, and then you also had mentioned that they had already built some.
They had started I think the AJ was completed, and there was an affordable housing project that was under construction at the same time we did.
Yeah,
the
it says here 2 residential buildings completed, and then.
Yeah, it was early stage, But it was also, it's also, if you've been to Sacramento, I think of this project as being what San Francisco Mission Bay was like 30 years ago. When those first financings were done for Mission Bay, it was old Catellus brownfield, right? It was old rail yards with significant brownfield remediation work that needed to get done. And so it's a little bit like that. It's just a different market and a different time frame. But that I would say Mission Bay is similar too in terms of significant remediation work done. The first CFD is done in a relatively early stage, and then coming back as development proceeded with subsequent financing. So this one has one big issuance that was done in 2022. They'll probably do additional debt at some point. Development up there has, the part of the problem is the timing with the pandemic. It was formed in 2018, the pandemic happened. So, when you're kind of ripe to go out to the markets was also a factor here. The big blank space you'll see right above the 5 was purchased, actually it was land that was already purchased at the time we did the bond sale by Kaiser to develop a
On the other side.
multi-billion-dollar hospital. But the hospital development timing was lagging, and that was affecting the timing of the other projects because there were some hotels planned that were, paying close attention to when the hotel was scheduled to open and such. So those are they all get kind of, those factors get considered.
Okay, yeah, the reason for my question, just, it's more about timing, trying to understand what would be the opportune time to, do a financing district.
Yeah, and usually the district is formed earlier than the debt. So the formation
you
can happen at
form
any
it,
point.
and there's no obligation
Right.
on the city. It's just, okay, we're going to form this. You had mentioned though in your presentation about the development agreement. So just kind of understanding sequence here,
So
you would, go through the public hearings, have your development agreement, and then
Typically.
do the district, because it's hard to know what you want unless you kind of figured
exactly.
out some of the details early on.
Exactly. And for some of these larger complicated projects, those overlap in that, they're starting to have conversations about the plan for the district before the development agreement is completed, but it lags. Sometimes you'll see in the development agreement the request for the creation of one of these districts. And so that's where those conversations are starting during that time, often, not always. But the CFD follows it. And again, you're usually sitting across the table from the developer, talking about what should get financed. There's a long laundry list of infrastructure needs.
Yes.
What might be eligible? What's realistic to, what can afford to be taken out through a CFD? And then those conversations are, it's a collaboration, really.
Yes.
It's because the property owner has to vote for the tax, and so they're an important part of the
Sure.
conversation.
No, that makes sense. Okay, so just from what you're saying, I mean, the CFD isn't, because you say it's in the early stages, but it's not the earliest stages. It's, there's a lot of things that happen
Yes.
prior to.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and the time of when the bond sale, the formation can happen very early. The bond sale is a conversation about readiness and ripeness of the credit. Is there a coherent story? Is there a plan? What we want to be able to say with a straight face to investors is, this is the plan. Here's how the developer is going to get there. And just these are the components of the story that's going to make this come to life.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Councilmember O'Connell.
Thank you. It was a very in-depth report. My question is, now, you commented that some of the projects that have used multiple financing structures are very large and complicated. Ours are even larger and more complicated. Most of the projects you've talked about that were brownfields or former landfills were already closed landfills. Theirs is not. And so, I think that there's still a lot of unknowns on what kind of cleanup and remediation is going to need to be done on these particular sites and what the cost is going to be. But my, concern with the tax base that the property is the collateral. If it's unclean property, how that, I'm not sure there'd be anyone who would want to buy it if it hasn't been remediated. And so how does a city protect themselves in that respect?
Well, the city controls the timing of when the bonds get sold. And that's where, you know, we're not doing these bond sales typically before the remediation is at least well along, if not complete. And so there's sometimes we'll see projects where there's, you know, another example would be, you know, we see a lot of these former military bases that have pretty significant brownfield cleanup. In Sacramento County, McClellan Airfield, for example, was an old base that was being redeveloped into a business park. And there, most of the cleanup had occurred. There are underground plumes that will be ongoing, monitored for forever, you know. So those that, but didn't prevent the development. They had the sign-offs from the state entities allowing for the development to proceed, allowing for the use of the land. In that case, the military had obligations to complete the cleanup before turning over the land, and they had allowed the developer to go ahead and complete, you know, accelerate the completion of that work. And so the land, and the CFD was initially formed on leasehold interest before the turnover had occurred. But again, that part, they were well into that process. So that's typical that the remediation is well along before we're doing that.
Again, that project that you mentioned, the military had a responsibility to pay for the cleanup. And I don't think we are in that situation here. And so again, you know, granted, the city would be the person to, you know, say when bonds could be issued, but it seems very convoluted, and I can see making a district before you even know what that wraparound is going to be. And then also with using San Francisco as some of the project, you know, where they are adding multiple layers of CDFs and enhanced financing districts and other things. Because they're the county, they get a much bigger portion of the pie and can afford to wrap those things around and not expect revenue return for a long time. Whereas we're a small city with a very limited budget. I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around what the cleanup and how quickly you could get the tax increment on residential with the limits, and you can only do a 1% or 2%, including all of the general obligation bonds. That's going to really limit what those districts can generate, even for the infrastructure that they're going to be needing. So I'm not sure how that really would pencil out in our particular project. And I know that your goal here is just to explain the functionality of these different kinds of financing and not explain the probability that any of these could work in our situation.
Right. And some of the tools that get used, I mean, San Francisco is exceptional in the share of the tax increment it's used. Other places are using them that have lower shares. That's part of the conversation. Again, part of the conversation with if an infrastructure financing district were used, one common approach is you want to create that district before the land values increase dramatically. You know, once cleanup occurs, values go up. Once construction starts, values go up. So part of the conversation is you want to set the template. You want to set that base year value as low as possible to increase the size of the revenue stream over time, regardless of the city's share, right? It's just how much of it are you capturing when you set that base year and you're capturing growth above it. And that, again, we work with the tools and the mechanics of this so that you're maximizing the ability to generate revenues for infrastructure. So creating the district does not force you to issue debt. Even in San Francisco's case, they held off on the formation of the infrastructure financing district until 2017. And then it didn't do the first tax increment bond sale until 2022, after there was the development was vertical and on the tax rolls. So again, that the timing of that, it's really specific to a project and what's happening, and there's wide variety in you know, timelines and readiness. But part of, you know, our job as an underwriter is to assess credit quality and do our due diligence, because we're helping you put together the story of the credit, and it has to be a credible story, and all of the known risks have to be disclosed to investors. So that's a big part of what we do when we're working through these. And again, that readiness is a big part of that as well, in setting that out.
And then you, again, in your presentation, you mentioned a revenue stream as triple net leases. What is that?
Oh, yeah, sorry for the terminology. So in the example of South San Francisco, that project, it's the developer owns the land, and instead of selling the building to the companies that are using the office space, they are leasing the buildings, and it's a triple net lease, meaning that while Kilroy's on the tax roll and is obligated to make sure the special taxes get paid, they've leased out the buildings to companies and said, hey, as part of your rent, you're going to pay the special tax. So that's where the tenant is obligated to cover all of the costs that are set out in the lease. And so from a credit perspective, it's advantageous because the companies using the space have an obligation to pay, and if they don't, the expectation is Kilroy is going to step in and pay because they don't want to lose title to the land. So it's sort of two parties that have a shared interest in getting the bonds paid, which is certainly our interest in getting the bonds paid. So that's helpful.
So why would it be called a triple net?
That's just a terminology of commercial leases that I don't know the why
Property
behind it.
tax and insurance.
Yes.
And the rent.
Pass through.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Councilmember Davis?
I had a follow-up question based on what Councilmember O'Connell asked. So I was a little bit confused about the conversation around using the districts as it pertains to environmental remediation. Were you just referring to an IFD?
So in the specific case of Sacramento Rail Yards, the remediation started long ago on that project.
But in taking that out.
Yeah, and so they had done, before California redevelopment agencies were dissolved in 2012, there was a tax increment district under the old redevelopment statutes that was a source of some funding for some of that work.
But in like today, because in your slide it mentions environmental remediation as being one of the projects that can be used with the that can be financed through a CFD. So is that common that you're seeing?
We see a lot of remediation work on a lot of these, particularly again when we shifted from greenfield suburban development to urban infill projects. There's a lot more reuse and redevelopment. So the environmental issues are much more common that we see now. When we're working with a project, there's usually a long laundry list of costs, infrastructure costs and other costs, and then the different financing tools. And so to some extent, money is fungible. And so usually you're sort of saying, okay, what are all the costs that have to be done? Which of these match the eligible uses under the financing tools we're talking about, CFDs and IFDs, and can be used for that purpose? And then how does the timing line up? And again, if there's $100 million of projects and there's capacity to reimburse for $40 million, you can kind of pick and choose what's getting reimbursed, and it depends a little bit about timing and ease of if it's a project the city's going to acquire or a public entity is going to acquire or not, and those are the conversations that,
like parks or.
And so if there's cleanup as part of improving property, that some of those costs get baked into the value of the what you're acquiring, right? You're acquiring cleaned up property with remediation. And so early on when we're forming a district, one of the important conversations is with bond counsel. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to speak for the bond counsel, but parsing through those kind of technical questions about, of all the things you want to finance, let's see which of these are easy to finance, which are harder to finance, which are eligible to finance, and then let's choose which ones make sense to reimburse for. And they're not all going to get reimbursed. And so there's not a right or wrong. Sometimes it's remediation. Sometimes there's remediation that's being funded other sources. Those are the conversations we have with the financing team and the lawyers and everybody.
So, and excuse me, because it's this is obviously not my area of expertise, and so I'm trying to wrap my head around all of this information, and it's quite complicated. But based on what you just said there, I would imagine you wouldn't be using an wouldn't be advantageous for a city to use an IFD for land that it's planning to acquire, because like we're not paying property taxes on that anyway. So
Right, so
we're
it's not,
there's not going to be revenue there for
so,
us to.
right, so, going back to it, like I'm thinking of another example, you're getting tax increment not just from the land that the city purchases, you're getting incremental property in the
Right.
district. So the district may be much larger than the park, right? And so to the extent that there's incremental revenues coming in from the other properties that can be used to help purchase that park, that's the.
I see. So, are you aware of any projects of this scale that don't use either financing tools? Or do you think that this is like,
I'm
to
sure
make
they're
something
out
like
there,
this
but-
happen, has to have these?
This is what I do, so I see all the projects that have this tool. I follow all the projects that have this tool. I'm sure there are projects that don't, but a lot of what we see, a lot of these very large projects, if you look at every military base reuse project in California in the last decade or 2 decades, I would venture a guess that, the majority, if not all of them, have used tools like this. And then other projects, again, I wouldn't say 100% of every development project has these tools, but a lot of the bigger ones certainly do.
So, I guess, we've seen a lot of success stories in your presentation, but I'm wondering, like, what are the true risks or pitfalls for a city? Obviously, Brisbane isn't San Francisco. We're really small, so we are, I think we are at risk, we don't have the ability to recoil in the same way.
So these financings are structured where the city has no obligation to make payments on the bonds. The city's obligation if the city's forming the district, the obligation is to make sure that the revenues are collected and taxes are levied and passed on to make payments. But it's really reputation risk. So your name's on the offering statement, and that's a good and bad. It's when your name's on the district, that has the advantage of, from a marketing perspective, of who this project is and where it is, and that's your strongest suit is your location, right? It's like you're right in the heart of the Bay Area, and people understand that. It's reputation risk, and that's why up front you're going to be asked to try to, like, the policies that are required to be adopted before you endeavor to go this route are intended to help you understand in more detail what the risks are and how to deal with these tools. For the most part, these tools have, the delinquency rates are relatively modest. Partly you have all these, you bring in a team of folks that have a lot of experience on these kinds of projects and are working on your behalf, right? Whether it's mayor, another person in my role, our legal obligation under the securities law and everything else is to be thorough and conducting thorough, thoughtful due diligence in understanding the project and in disclosing risks to investors and all of that. And so there are a lot of outside eyes that, with the goal of helping you sort through this. Doesn't mean there's no risk, it just means that that's part of the process is getting a good team and then making sure that the process is, you guys are really early in the process. I know you don't have a development agreement in place yet, so some of these questions you're asking are down the line, and so it's hard to answer the specifics of them, but that's, the idea is just to, prime the pump for the conversations that are going to happen over time here.
I think that's the extent of my current questions.
Okay.
I'm sure I might have more.
Thank you. Councilmember Kern?
Thank you so much, Eileen. Your timing on this is fantastic. This has been very educational, so I appreciate it. You are delivering a lot of information. Great questions by my other council mates here on these items. So I have a little PTSD, as I was a property owner between 1990 and 1992 when the bottom fell out. We thought that was the worst we were ever going to see, and then along comes 2007, right? And so Is there a situation where the city of Brisbane would be left holding debt on property that's well below market value? And is there any risk that we might have? And what will we do in a situation like that?
Yeah, so I was asked to speak to a National Association of Financial Analysts about this exact topic in 2012. And in the 1990s, California was kind of the poster child for defaulted bonds, real estate-backed bonds. In 2000, fast forward to 2012, and at that point we were, 4 years into the kind of post-crash. And 2008, everyone was worried about this. What's going to happen to all the debt that's been issued and how are things going to go? And remarkably, the California came through it with flying colors to the most part. Not that there were zero defaults, but there were very few defaults. And the stats I put together back in 2012, California was something like 45 or 50% of the overall CFD issuance and 2% of the defaults. And the reason for that change was a lot of things. It was a lot of things that the state put into place in between the 90s and the 2000s, in things like requiring you to have local goals and policies and creating a lot more education and infrastructure around that. So CDAC, the California Debt and Investment Advisory Committee, it's a state entity out of the state treasurer's office, does a lot of training. I was part of the panel of a 2 or 3 day conference on land secure that they put on every couple of years. So it's been I guess it was a 2-day this year, where they're, for 2 days, staff are sitting in a room listening to all this stuff and hearing this and asking questions about these kinds of topics to be more knowledgeable. CDAC also puts out guidance. In the late 90s, they put out guidance on how to appraise the property values, and so that there's not a monkey business going on in the valuation. There was also in the 90s a lot of kind of rogue players, and the SEC came down, the state came down, and those rogue players are no longer in the business. So what we saw coming out of the Great Recession was remarkable resilience in the sector. What we saw often, and again, it was a different kind of crisis. In the 90s, it was developers going under. In the 2000s, it was a combination of developer stress, but also homeowner stress. And what we found to a large degree is where there was a lender in the room, that helps. So whether it's a developer with a construction loan or a homeowner with a mortgage, if the homeowner isn't paying their tax bill, often the banks stepped in and made the payment. It's worth a $2,000 payment to keep the $500,000 house, right? Where we saw stress, because there were some defaults, where we saw defaults was when both the developer went under and the bank went under. And those were relatively limited, fortunately, but that's the ones where we saw kind of big challenges. That's what happened. So again, a lot has changed in the partly the governance issues in California around this have changed since the 90s. And then the way these bonds are structured, they used to be, you do one big issuance for this whole multi-phase project. That's not how they're done anymore. They're, as you've seen, we've kind of phased them and kind of moved through them in a more digestible format to manage risk and manage exposure.
Thank you for that answer.
Sure.
So I see here that the standard is 3-to-1 when we're talking about value, the value to lien ratio.
Yep.
The South San Francisco example that we were talking about a little bit earlier, they had a 25-to-1,
Yes.
a very, very, very conservative assessed value. If we were to head down this path and we're starting to do this thinking, how do we set that value to make sure it's exactly at the right sweet spot, that we get the investors, but we're also very conservative?
Yeah, you don't set the value is what it is, right? The property values are going to be what the values are at the time. I mean, the reason that the Oyster Point project looked like it did is they issued late in the process. So those buildings were built, leased, and occupied before we did the first bond sale, and it was at the height of the market. It was 2018, 2019, and we did the first sale. So the valuations came out
Crazy.
extraordinary. They were $1 billion plus valuation. They could have issued all 105 million at that time, leveraging the tax capacity of all 4 phases. They only wanted to leverage the tax capacity of the first phase as a developer that's, obligated to make the payment if no one else does. And they wanted to wait until their second phase was built before they put a tax on themselves, essentially. So, again, there's parties here, there's an element of they have, their own self-interest that they're managing too. And because the developer in that case was quite conservative, that's why partly why the values, and again, it's a completed life science project in South San Francisco, it's very valuable real estate.
Okay. I didn't see anywhere in the presentation here, and it doesn't mean that you don't consider it in your planning and when you're coming up with your formulas here, but I don't see anything in here about like environmental volatility. So our scientists have done a pretty good job to date in predicting on what's going on,
Yep.
and we're having a lot of faith that they're going to be good in those calculations. But what happens if something goes south and these projections are way off? Then who's stuck and how do you get unstuck?
Yeah, I mean, those are fair questions, and that's something that for every financing we do, whether it's a CFD financing or general obligation bond, we're having those conversations with issuers all around the state, whether it's wildfire risk or sea level rise or flooding or you name it. Those are real risks that we talk about, and there's no, California has long had has had seismic risk for forever, so that's always been the kind of like in the back of everyone's mind about seismic risk, but the list of risks that we evaluate and disclose to investors has gotten a lot longer. Some of these projects, one of the ones I think we talked briefly about in Alameda was redeveloping an old marina area, and part of the project that they financed was a new seawall. So they raised the protection against a rising sea level rise to I forget how many feet. Again, is that enough? I don't know. All you can work on is the best information you have. That doesn't mean there won't be a fire or earthquake or a flood, but you're using the best information you have to make thoughtful decisions, and then you're disclosing the risks to investors so that they're making thoughtful investment choices.
Nobody has a crystal ball.
Right.
My final question, everyone knows that's a
Yeah.
lie. Regarding the IFD very specifically,
Yep.
and I'm going to use the best language that I have to answer this question.
Yep.
I already asked this question. So if I'm looking towards the future, and this is the increase in property value that we would be recouping, are we not, for lack of a better term, cannibalizing some money from our future general fund for the purposes of support of government services in our community?
That's why I say there's no new tax, there's no new revenue. This is not, you're not creating anything new. It's not like you're creating an additional revenue stream. And so that's the caveat I always use with IFDs. You're not creating a new revenue stream. If the property values go up, you get your share of the 1% rate no matter what. Like, so you're not creating something new. And so where people think about this, and again, it's a policy choice, not my bailiwick, but is you can choose to sort of say, I want this is a really big project that's going to have all these other benefits that we care about and we want it to happen, or we're going to make development pay its fair share, so this is part of what they're generating, and therefore we can kind of count it back towards them. So and then it can also be like, well, how much of our share do we want to dedicate? You have a choice of how much you dedicate, and it can change annually up to the time that bonds are issued. And so those are part of the conversation of, what do you want to put what's on the table here to think through and talk about.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions.
Okay, thank you. Eileen, this has really been comprehensive, and I almost think we'll probably have to bring you back because I think we'll have way more questions. I want to go back to Councilmember O'Connell mentioned teeter plan, and I don't know if I missed it in your response. You said that not all counties will participate. What's the situation in San Mateo County?
I honestly don't, off the top of my head, I don't know. I think San Mateo offers teeter. I don't know if they allow CFDs to participate or not. It varies. Of the 58 counties in California, I want to say something like 40-something have offered the teeter plan. And then within that, some percentage allow CFDs to participate and some don't. And it just varies.
Okay, because it sounds like an interesting avenue to go.
It's a county taking the risk of collections on your behalf,
Right.
and it's a nice service that they provide effectively.
Right. So looking at, I'm going to dovetail off of several of my colleagues' questions to you, probably the elephant in the room. Our worst case scenarios, because we are a small city and risk is very important to us. Let's talk about Hunters Point. So you have remediation, it's all signed off, houses are built, people move in, there's a district, and then suddenly things go south. And you don't want that to happen anywhere, least of all here. But it happened. What happens? That land is collateral even on a teeter plan, well, how does the county collect? There's nothing to collect when someone can't live in their house. What happens when things go south?
In Hunter's Point case, I believe the answer is a lot of litigation about whose fault was that, and I don't know where that stands in Hunter's Point case in terms of litigation. Those are worst case scenarios in terms of what happens in that event. That's in general what you're looking at is we're as an investment banker, I'm not a scientist. You're relying on the environmental experts that do this, the regulators that are coming in and signing off on something and telling you, yes, it's sufficiently cleaned. And what does that mean? I don't know what sufficiently cleaned is. Like, I couldn't walk out around a site and tell you yes or no. And so you're kind of relying on the experts to do that. And, they're not without mistakes sometimes, but I don't know how you ever inoculate against a risk like that in any development project.
So I don't follow the bond market carefully at all. But in looking at climate change, we've had worldwide disasters in the last 5 years. Are we seeing the rates on bonds increase because of that?
Our markets are not. The short answer is not really. We saw in the wake of the fires last January in Southern California, the borrowing costs for the LA utilities went way up because they have not just payment, dislocation during that time of people moving around, but they also have, some of their power lines that were, arguably at fault. And so they have significant litigation exposure. And so that's where we've seen some impacts, but otherwise there's been relatively modest impacts. And there's a fair amount of development activity that's happening, in areas that are fire prone and flood prone.
And is it more difficult to shop a bond with a brownfield development?
There's more questions about it. Yeah, I would say the disclosure process is more involved. So if you picked up the official statement for the rail yards project, there's pages and pages and pages of discussions about what studies were done and who did the work and what was the sign off from the regulators and all of the process that goes into getting to a point where you're allowed to develop on that, and that's disclosed to investors. Here's what we know. This is what happened. This is how the land had been used originally. This is what work has been done to make it viable.
And where you have less than 12 property owners in a specific area and you form a district, can you just put lines around? I mean, that just seems such an anomaly to me. Maybe you have 3-4 property owners. Do you exclude them from the district? Do you put them in the district?
Yes.
Do you draw very irregular borders? Is that commonly done?
Most often you have a big geography that's, if a developer owns a whole swath or a handful of developers own a whole swath, usually that's on the table and it may be carved into phased projects, but usually it's one large thing. You can have non-contiguous CFDs, and we've done that in places either because there's development happening in a couple different pockets or in cases where, like, in San Francisco, Trans Bay, they tax only completed buildings in the immediate geography around the Trans Bay, the new bus station there. And there, the CFD was created when it was already developed, right? There's already, 100-old buildings in that area, and the city changed land use and said, okay, if you want to go high and you want to go dense, you can do that if you join the CFD. So they used a different tool. And so it's literally the buildings that have taken advantage of these land use tools are the only ones that are in the district. So it's 11 different buildings in the downtown area. So you have the ability to do that. It's less often used.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Very interesting. Councilmember Lentz, you have more questions?
I do. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Please.
All right. So if there is a foreclosure, I'm assuming that when we set these things up, you go through a title search to make sure that the entities that you think own the land.
Yes, it's usually it's often a part of not always, but it's often part of the appraisal, the process of figuring that out. Looking at the, ownership transfers and things like that. And then the foreclosure process, when it occurs, even in significant delinquencies, it's pretty rare that a property goes to foreclosure sale, because usually either the property owner steps in and finds a way of payment, but if there's debt on the property, it's often the lender that will take over the land and make the payment on the.
Okay, so just trying to,
Yeah.
figure out all those what ifs. So, say the property did go into, or the district went into foreclosure, and there was a lien on the property. So where would the city be in regards to that?
So the special taxes are paid first. It's on parity with the property tax lien. So if there's a foreclosure on property and you collect, and someone, if you went to a foreclosure sale and someone bids on the property out of that, those proceeds are used to bring current the special tax delinquencies first. Again, and these are, it's not that the district necessarily goes delinquent, it's a parcel by parcel obligation, it's a parcel by parcel lien. So you have a developer, you have a specific parcel that has not paid its taxes, and you're putting that out for sale. You're using those revenues to pay the overdue property taxes, and that's ahead of any lender's mortgage obligations behind the tax obligations.
Okay, all right. And then, that page that had all the lists of what a CFD special tax finance could do, it's on page 11. And so under ongoing services, so it says that it must be incremental to services offered before district establishment, and it can't supplement prior existing services, often determined through a fiscal impact analysis. So, it talks about examples of the services like police service and fire service. And what happens when you have, a development where you're doing it in phases, but you haven't built the fire station, perhaps, or you haven't built the police station, so you have to use your existing services, or maybe, the development requires an upgrade of some existing facility that then would service that subject area. So what I'm getting at is that, can you use the money for outside of the district if you can provide the nexus?
Yeah, so often on the capital side, the special tax revenues are maybe funding a fire station that's not in the district at all, but serves the district, and it may also serve other, so it's not exclusive.
Yeah.
But if it's, you're creating on the capital side, you have much more flexibility to do that. On the services side, what the intent of the law is, like, if you have, 10 firemen in town, and then all this new development comes in, and you say, oh, we only need 5 firemen in town, and we're gonna have 5 over here paid from that is what this intent is trying to stop. It's like, if you had 10 firemen in town and now you need 15, that incremental 5 could be funded from this services tax. That's the concept anyway of, the theory of what you're trying to
Okay,
do with that.
but there's some flexibility, and it's not so like everything has to stay within that frame.
In terms of location, no, it doesn't have to be like on site.
Okay.
It's, serving the district, because again, you're paying for the incremental services of whether it's police and fire that are maybe domiciled outside the district.
Okay. And then, throughout the document, it talks about, how the bonds for some projects were released to reimburse the developer. One was for the roads, I think it was in Fremont, the other, like in South City, reimbursed the developer only after phased infrastructure was completed and accepted. And so, like, in my mind, I think, okay, well, here's this project. It's the developer's responsibility to pay the cost for these things. So can you just kind of square up the reimbursement part? Because that seems kind of odd.
Yeah, the way to think about this is a way of allowing, it's allowing those costs to be financed on a tax exempt basis, is essentially, because ultimately the city's going to own the parks or the water or the sewer or the roads, and so the city could go out and put those facilities in, but most often you're sort of saying, oh, let the development kind of cover those costs. So it's a way of giving some benefit of the fact that you have a tax exempt ability to do it on a tax exempt basis, and that's going to lower the cost of the home to the resident. It's going to lower the, ultimate impact on the development by having a lower cost of funds. It's going to make the project more likely to be successful by having a lower cost of capital in there.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is structured really, it's like takeout financing, right? So the development you put in the sewer, and then you can come in and refinance it essentially on a tax exempt basis, because now it's going to be a city-owned sewer, and the obligation is still on the residents in the district that are paying for it now, but it's a way of offering a benefit essentially, because it is the public facility piece of it.
Okay. All right. I mean, thank you for the explanation.
Yeah, and this tool was created in the wake of Prop 13, right? When the ability for cities to finance infrastructure got hamstrung. So this was a way of sort of creating an alternative way of accessing tax exempt finance for these new projects without putting the burden on existing residents.
Okay. And then the last question, at least for now. So say for a particular project that was operated by a different public agency, not the city, but within the city.
Yep.
So can they work with a property owner to create a district within where their project is located and then do the bonds? Is that?
Yeah, and the rule of thumb is 51% of the projects.
Got to be owned by a public
so
agency, so
we've
it
seen
doesn't have to
examples.
be the city.
So in Southern California, there's a big project called Essentia, where the first financing was done by the water district, and because the water 51% of the proceeds were being used for water projects. So the water district was the issuer for the first series of bonds, and then the county was the issuer for subsequent series because those other projects were being done. So there were sort of two different projects, two different district structures. They can sometimes be overlapping. So part of the conversation up front, when you're looking at this and looking at the financing plan and the entitlements, it's like, who's going to finance it? And often, if you're funding something that's going to be, some of it's going to be acquired by the city, some of it might be acquired by a water district or a park and rec district that's apart from the city, not in your case, but whatever jurisdictions. In those cases, you enter into an agreement with them up front that, we're going to acquire the roads, specialty districts are going to acquire the fire facilities or the water or whatever it is when there's a jurisdiction that has separate obligations to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the concerns are, there's only so much tax capacity, and if somebody else formed a district and had the ability to come in and overlap, that's always a risk. So, again, the city could do a citywide assessment for something like a special tax, citywide special tax for new libraries or something, whatever it is, and that would be on everybody in the city, including that property. So that's something that we look at are there other overlapping obligations that are going to be stacked onto that property, and we consider that when we look at how much tax capacity is there and how is it being allocated.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does, and it's interesting you bring that up. So I didn't know that the city has the authority to be able to bring in other areas outside a particular scope, if, of course, you have the buy-in from those property
And in that
owners.
case, if you were doing a citywide CFD, it would be a vote of the
Everyone would
electorate.
have to vote on it. Mm.
And so sometimes people do that as an alternative to a GO when it's still a 2/3 approval process, but the tax gets spread differently. So in a GO, the cost is being spread on an assessed value, which has political and equity issues depending on the tax base. Whereas with a CFD, you can kind of control. So for example, Santa Cruz County was doing a library district where rather than having it based on assessed value, which is going to vary based on when you bought your property, right? They have a per home tax rate. If you have a house, you pay X. If you have, developed land, you pay Y. And so you have that ability to do that too. But again, when we're looking at a particular project, we're looking at everything that's on the tax bill. And that's using that tax capacity.
All right, no, that's interesting. No, I didn't think about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember O'Connell?
I really don't have any other questions at this time, other than at what point does it become infeasible to do this taxing structure? At what point does the cost of a project too much for the lifespan of the bond to repay?
Well, typically the CFD is not the sole source of funding the projects, right? There's vertical construction costs, there's infrastructure costs, and this is a tool in the toolbox, really. So it's not, so if your question is, when does development become infeasible? When is the cost of development too much for what the upside is? That's a different question. Our tool is just one piece of the picture. It's not usually the sole source of funding. So there's developer equity and there's other land sales. Once you're developed, if this were 100% residential subdivision, say, the developer is going to put equity in up front, and then they're going to maybe use some bond proceeds from this tool. Then they're also going to sell land to builders or to homeowners, and that's another source of revenue. So the part of what we look at when we're doing our due diligence on financing is what are all the costs of the project, infrastructure and vertical construction, and what's the source? Who's paying for it, and is there financing in place?
You would be looking at the equity that the developer would potentially be putting in as a starting matrix.
Yeah, and again, we're looking at this, our bond sales down the line, there's, the development, the no-go on the development is is upstream from our role. So those conversations about, and even, in a market like this, in San Francisco, there wasn't a lot of office development done over the last however many years, right, since the pandemic. And now all of a sudden I just read a headline today about a new residential building that's going to start construction or, pursue approvals, because now the financing market has shifted and there's demand and there's financing available. So those conversations are not a static conversation. And, again, the cost of construction varies in different market climates, and the cost of access to financing and cost of financing varies. So those are bigger issues about a project's viability. Our tool is a little, one part of that conversation is not the totality of it. If that makes sense?
Yes, but you look at the totality of it when you're going to sell that.
100%, yes. And we disclose that. We'll sort of say, here's what in order for this to be a built-out community, here are all the costs, all the infrastructure that has to be put in place. This is the expected source of those funds. This is the timing of that, and this is what the cash flows look like.
And then it's another thing with the legal owners. When you say there's more than 12 property owners, would this be at a point where a developer would take, and I mean, this is a huge, huge landmass, would that already be in LLCs where each little section could be 50 parcels or LLCs that would then be 50 voters?
It's not based on property owner, it's based on registered voters living in the district. So someone would have to be living there and registered to vote within the geography of the district.
Okay, and I'll leave the LLC question later for legal staff.
That's
go
not
on another day.
Yeah,
But
they
thank you
wouldn't.
very-
Yeah, they wouldn't be a registered voter. So it's like real people living in the district is what that's based on.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yep.
Councilmember Davis?
I asked all my questions.
Okay. Councilmember Kern?
No further questions this time. Thank you very much.
All right. Before we go on, I do want to open up to the public, but I would like to know, we've got Sarah and Marty online. Are there any comments that they would like to make you're listening to a lot of things, points that you would like to make? We'll start with Sarah, just based upon what you've heard and the questions being asked.
I do actually. Thank you so much. Just real quickly, my background, I've been in this business for 25 years, and I have been involved in working out some of the districts that were heading towards default earlier in my career. And we have not seen, a lot of conversation has happened around risk and what the risk is for the city in going down this path. And and what I wanted to give you a couple of anecdotes about that. When we started out doing financing, this type of financing, even 20 years ago at this point, the bond official statement was probably 50 pages long. Didn't have, the depth of information. Now we're seeing bond official statements that are 250 pages long. So the level of due diligence that goes into the document that is used as an offering statement by the financing team is much more significant than it was. We're looking at all of the factors, such as the environmental hazards are all being looked at, understanding the ownership, understanding the property owners' plans for development, and all of that. And the document is just a lot more all-encompassing. And I think that reflects the fact that all of the team members, from the appraiser to the underwriter to the attorneys and the special tax consultant or other types of consultants, are all just doing a lot more due diligence as it relates, and that we've probably learned, hopefully, from things that have gone sideways in the past. And so I think that these issuances, Eileen said this as well, we haven't seen really defaults on CFD bonds in recent years. And that is a significant change from where CFDs started in the 1980s. So I just wanted to add that additional context. And then one last piece is that I have worked personally on the formation and ongoing administration of a CFD that was significantly impacted by the Eaton fire in Altadena. The library district there has a CFD, they've issued debt, and they had almost half of the homes in their community burn. So we're in a situation where, aside from the obvious, personal tragedy that those folks experienced, we're now looking from a bondholder perspective and a disclosure perspective. And are we able to continue levying the special taxes on those properties where those homes have burned in order to continue paying the bondholders, right? Because the district has an obligation to pay those bondholders. And in this situation, homes are expected to be rebuilt and so forth at some point. And the CFD rate and method of apportionment was written in such a way that the district does have the ability to continue to levy those annual special taxes on the property so that they can still continue to collect funds and pay those bondholders. We're still feeling that out as we go. They were delinquencies early on, particularly because the state delayed property tax payments for a lot of those homeowners. But we are seeing, even in this situation, most of those homeowners or property owners, I guess I should say now, not homeowners. That's really sad. But the property owners there are paying those taxes because they intend to rebuild. So I wanted to offer that anecdote in a real life situation of literally this half of this community burning down, and the CFD is still moving forward, still making its obligations, and at this point not having to pursue any foreclosure on any property owners.
I have a question.
That's very interesting. Councilmember Davis, you have a question on that?
And now that the due diligence is so much more expansive than it was in the past, are you coming across projects where you say, no, you're not a candidate for this type of financing district?
I haven't run into that personally. There are definitely conversations about readiness and gosh, is there enough forward momentum for us to feel comfortable proceeding with this? Is the value sufficient to get to a 3-to-1 value to lien? And that's usually the point at which that property value is often a gating constraint on when the bonds get issued. If the property values haven't yet materialized, then usually we're waiting until there's more investment into the project before we go forward.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah, very much. That was really interesting. Marty, how about you? Yeah, any comments to add to this?
Yeah, just a couple. One, and to kind of follow up on the question that was just asked, as Eileen mentioned, waiting to issue bonds helps with that readiness question. But also as the city goes and I believe that we've got the guidelines already adopted, but I believe they predate me and my involvement with the city. So we definitely need to look at refreshing them, but laying out those conditions and that essentially the criteria for the city to consider a project like this will weed out projects that don't necessarily qualify or are anywhere near being ready for this type of financing. And again, remember what Eileen talked about in terms of there is the creation of the district, and then at some point in time in the future, and it may follow quickly, it may follow by years, the actual issuance of the bonds. Those are not things that have to happen one right after the other. And then the last point I wanted to make, just to reiterate, was as we're talking about CFDs, those are charges against the property. And then as Councilmember Kern pointed out very directly, the IFDs are basically taking a portion of revenue that would otherwise be going to the city that could be used for some other purpose, redirecting that for use in the project. And so, just recognize that as we have discussions over the coming months, as all of this continues forward.
Okay, thank you. Very good. All right, any burning council questions? Because I'd like to open to the public. No? Okay, do we have anyone? Yes, thank you, Ingrid. Peter Sutherland. Hello.
Honorable Mayor, council members, I haven't been following the Baylands project that closely, so I'm going to come clean with that right away. But I'm just curious, all this bond talk about exactly what is looking to be financed and exactly where money can come from the state for the cleanup and issues like that, because reading between the lines, it sounds like Brisbane is on the hook for the environmental cleanup and also for most of the infrastructure, if not all of it. So I'm trying to get a perspective about where this bond financing fits in to the overall picture of the development of the Baylands going forward.
Anybody want to tackle that one?
And I apologize if it's a very rudimentary question, but this is what's coming up for me.
I think part of the answer to you, I'm going to let our city manager respond as well.
Great.
I think part of it has to all be sorted out, and we're not that far along yet.
Okay. Is there any kind of commitment from the state or the developer or the owner to participate in this kind of remediation, environmental remediation, or in the infrastructure at this point? I mean, the development agreement must be quite far along.
Actually,
Well, the development, so thank you. I don't know how much, thank you, Madam Mayor. It's good to see you, Peter. So a couple things. First of all, the developer has an obligation to clean up the site.
Okay, that's good to hear.
This will not move forward unless that happens. Now, it gets a little more nuanced. So within the specific plan and the EIR, you'll see things mentioned related to the remediation plan. That plan has been in front of the various bodies and they've signed off on it, but that doesn't mean that the plan hasn't moved forward, right? They haven't actually started doing the work. So that's where the concern has been at the council level. The conversations I've had with the developer, they're fully cooperative. They want any support they can throughout this process. We're happy to give it to them if there's a way to do that. I think they're here. So they're listening to all of this. So I'm not concerned from that perspective at all. Where I think one of the things you heard tonight, Peter, is the concern that there may be things that are that even if we've crossed all our T's and dotted our I's, there still may be an issue out there. How do we get to a place where we can get 100%? And that's the challenge, I think. But so far, the developer has a plan that has been reviewed by two bodies that we need more to move forward. So we'll continue to bring that forward. I don't know if I'm answering your question. It's such a broad question that I'm not sure where to go with it.
It's a very broad question, yeah.
And we can talk offline too, Peter, if you want to give me a call. I can
Well,
probably
I'm sure
get you.
there are other
Yeah.
people who'd love to hear the breakdown of this kind of conversation.
Sure. Well, and there's things running concurrently too. To your point, the development agreement conversations running concurrently to this. I'm the guy who gets to do that. Parts of this conversation affect that, parts of it don't, as you heard tonight. It's nice to know maybe what direction we're sort of going in and to understand what may be in the development agreement, but we'll have some time in order to suss that out. The third piece is the actual documents themselves that are coming out in the end of March. So the final draft documents will be available, and that's when we'll take it through the process with the Planning Commission and the Council.
Okay. And how does that all pertain to infrastructure development? Is that 100% on Brisbane, or is that also a shared responsibility?
Do you want me to continue?
Sure.
Okay. I just want to make sure that we're doing that. So whose responsibility is what is the question?
Well,
Or,
for the infrastructure development.
well, I think
I know
that's,
that's a broad category, but is there any kind of commitment from the developers to participate in that?
yes.
Or is that something Brisbane is completely on the hook for?
Well, we do it through these financing tools with the developer.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a close relationship there. Part of tonight is understanding where the council may be going. That's helpful for the conversations that I'm having offline with the developer and understanding what tools they're considering as well. As we get closer to that, and it'll likely be in this universe,
Okay.
we'll take that forward. The development agreement has other components associated with it. It could have infrastructure components associated with it, but the EIR and the specific plan have identified infrastructure that we believe to be needed in order to bring the project forward, and that's what we're trying to figure out how to finance tonight.
Okay. Are we, is the Baylands probably going to be several districts, or is it now being considered as one overall development district?
I don't think we know that answer yet.
Okay.
That's a fair question.
Okay.
And as far as
Just
development
curious.
agreements, nothing's final until those are final.
Yeah.
Okay. So if there are multiple districts, there will probably have to be a development agreement for each.
That would all have to be worked out with the developer.
Probably not. You're going to have one development agreement for the whole project. You might have different tools financing components of the project,
Okay.
but one development agreement to manage the
Okay. Great.
entirety of it. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for answering my questions.
To the extent I could.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Michelle? You next.
Michelle Salmon, Brisbane resident. I do have some questions and concerns, and one of them is the use of the word developer versus owner. And I think that's a really important distinction because while we may have a development agreement, who is that agreement with? Is it with the owner of the property? Is it with the various developers? These kind people here are employees of the owner, but we keep referring to them as the developer. But who is actually going to be developing each part of this may be several different entities. And then I'm also concerned of what happens if we move forward and the owner does not or does not take responsibility to move forward. I know that I know they're very anxious to get, seems like they're very anxious to get vested rights to develop, but are they really going to do it? They've had vested rights for other properties, and I haven't seen really any development. So I have grave concerns over this, and even though it's a quote-unquote a new company, it's really not. It's the same family that has owned this property for a very long time, since 1982, I believe, when they got it from Ingersoll. So I am concerned about that. I really am, because we are putting a lot of time, money, energy, personnel into this. I'm still waiting to find out the answers to questions that we had on the draft EIR for the specific plan. I think that there's some discrepancies between what the specific plan is and what the draft EIR for the specific plan is. And a lot of questions went unanswered from the program draft EIR that were supposed to be addressed in the specific plan EIR that I'm not seeing addressed. So I have overall concerns about levels of responsibility, levels of financing, levels of promise to move forward, and who the players really are between who the owner is and who the developer/developers will be. Because I don't believe the owner is actually going to be the developer of each phase of the project. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, to one of the points that was brought up, unless I'm missing something, and Tom will correct me here very quickly, the development agreement stays with the development. So if the owner sells their property, the development agreement will stick with that new owner, if you will. They'll be the developer at that time. So I'm pretty sure we'll be able to capture whatever the issues are as they move through.
I think she was making the distinction of the developers we're dealing with are not the owners at the present time. They are not the actual owners. Is that correct?
So, if I may, my understanding is the owner's representatives, or who we are dealing with at the time,
Correct.
They may very well negotiate a development agreement and then want to sell the rights to develop. But as the city manager said, the development agreement, those terms flow with that sale. You don't go out, buy it, and then say, okay, we want to renegotiate. Well, you can try that. Legally, you don't have the right to renegotiate.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tom. Had another member of the public? Yes, come on forward.
Good evening, Mary Rogers, resident of Brisbane. My questions are pointed to very high-level process. So until the development agreement is signed and buttoned down, things are cleaned up, we won't know what that forecast might be, the whole project. That needs to be laid out, and we need to understand what those milestones are. Those milestones are going to tell us when we need to finance the different tools that have been brought to our attention, the CFDs and the IFDs. So my question is, and I just don't know, the CFDs sound like that's when a bond will be issued. And my understanding is taxpayers need to approve that bond. Is that correct?
Sorry.
We could share.
So the CFD, it's a defined boundary and can be defined however you want to define it. It's the property owners within that district vote, and they vote on a tax on themselves only. It doesn't expand beyond the district. If there are more than 12 registered voters living within the geography of that district, then it's a vote of the electorate of that district.
So if the CFD shows that we need $50 million, then a District 2 would be responsible for the taxes on that $50 million, not the Brisbane residents that live here in town. Okay,
Correct.
That's what I wanted clarification on. And then secondly, the IFDs, I think it sounds like we're just borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. We're just going to use those funds to for road work or whatever the case might be. But is there an authorization committee that will decide whether or not we can spend that money from the general fund to the IFD? Is there an approval process that will need to happen to do that?
It goes into a fund, right?
Those decisions about what monies are dedicated to an infrastructure financing district are determined as part of the formation process. It's commemorated in, the city's going to form a district.
Okay.
These are the revenues that are
expected, right? Expected.
They define what can be committed to the
Can
district,
be-
and so it's a public process.
And that becomes financeable. Well, it's not.
It's
coming out.
allowing. The city could say we're going to allow our share of property tax revenues.
Yes.
To be directed to the district. the county may say, hey, we'll
Yeah.
direct ours there as well.
But
And then that
can-
becomes the revenue pot that you're then looking to run.
So can the city use property taxes received from Old Brisbane for, no,
Just
okay.
Within the geography of the
Okay.
district.
You're just earmarking, right? You're earmarking future property tax and saying this area is we're gonna say that we're gonna take a certain amount of the property taxes generated by that property and reinvest it back into that area versus it, and maybe that's all of the property taxes that would come through the city. Maybe it's a portion, right? Or it's no new revenue, or you just say, we're letting everything come into the general fund as it normally would, and we'll determine where that money is gonna go, right?
Yeah, so it's I think of it as almost like an accounting exercise, if you want to segregate
Yeah.
it and sort of say, we're going to say, this
Yeah.
development's going to create all of this activity, so we're going to allow a portion of the revenues generated from it to go back to
reinvest.
Yeah.
So what happens if you need $50 million for IE District 2 and you don't have enough people in that district to fund that? What happens then?
So the districts form, so typically what we see with these districts, they're formed early on. And again, the bonds may not be issued for a while, the tax may not be issued initially, levied initially. And then over time, that whoever owns the property is obligated to pay the tax. So that may be a developer.
Okay.
And the developer may be selling parcels to home builders or office builders
Right.
to do that. And then they may be turning around and selling units to homeowners. And then whoever owns the parcel, whether it's a developer or a home builder or a resident, pays the tax. And that tax formula allocates kind of in what order that tax gets spread.
All right.
It runs with the land, right? So if somebody you're going in, you're gonna say, I'm gonna buy this townhome. I would imagine that, and as you're getting approved to purchase, you know what the HOA is gonna be, you're gonna know what your CFD contribution is gonna be in advance, and if that's gonna go up incrementally over time. And then if you needed to levy a new one, right, then now there's more property owners in that district, and they would all need to vote on whether they're going to increase their tax by a certain amount annually. So I would think that everyone would be aware.
Yeah. And
Going
it only
into
affects
it.
them in that district.
Okay. That's what I didn't understand. I thought it was everybody in Brisbane would have to pay a portion of that, but it's based on the districts that are formed for this project.
Yeah.
So now you just brought up another question. So then the obligation of Brisbane owning up to the build of 1,800 to 2,000 homes for the Baylands, that still remains the same. So if you have a district that is, the developer is asking for more homes to be built, that can't happen, correct?
Correct.
That's
Yeah,
under
that's-
Measure
Right, so that's-
JJ.
right,
That was
okay.
locked
Let's
in.
go back to the voters.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Alrighty, thank you. Answer my question.
Thank you. Peter, you had another question?
I have one more brief question. Does the developer have any sway or input into the bond rating, the amount of money, and also what terms the bond is issued at?
No, those are, I mean, they obviously have an interest in getting the lowest possible interest rate and the highest amount of proceeds. That's typically their request, but it's, and they're often, it's usually a collaborative process. So they may be saying, hey, I've put X amount of infrastructure and now I'm ready for a reimbursement. Can we look at the bond financing? They may come to the city and ask the city to issue debt on a certain timeline. It's the city's decision to do that. And there may be timelines in the development agreement, who knows? But then once they are helpful because they are helping us tell the story. So when we're putting together the official statement and talking to investors, I'm also often asking for information from the developer, and we're helping to use that information in disclosing the story and the risks about that. But that it's not their decision and it's
So
not their
there's
control.
not a blacklist of developers
No.
that could influence or affect the bonds?
No.
Okay. That brings me to one last question.
Could you just step up to the
sure.
microphone, please?
One last question. When the development agreement is put in place, and if the owner sells different parcels or different parts or everything to one developer, does the city have any input in rejecting the future developers based on, I don't know, a bad track record or bad credit ratings or incomplete projects or anything like that?
Sounds like a question for legal, Tom.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, the question is if the current owner or some owner down the road decides to sell to a developer who doesn't have a great reputation in completing projects or messing around with terms and stuff like that, does the city have the ability to reject that developer from purchasing that part of the development?
So as it stands, I did understand it the first time. I was hoping I misunderstood. So because we're negotiating the development agreement, I'm just going to give you a response in theory. You can build in terms like that into a development agreement. But as you can imagine, if somebody's coming along wanting to buy the property from the owner who has agreed to the development agreement, it's not surprising that some of the folks who come along with that kind of money and want to develop start raising their own objections or terms, trying to get a better deal from the city. In that instance, what's the city's recourse? It really depends on what we've put into the final agreement. And that's being negotiated right now.
Okay, great. I hope those terms and conditions are in the final agreement. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ingrid, do we have anyone online wishing to speak? No? Okay. I don't see any more questions. Yes, no, no. Okay.
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
before you jump into this next little bit, we've asked a lot of you this evening. We've asked the council to absorb a tremendous amount of information about these various financing tools. We're not expecting, nor were we asking in the staff report for a recommendation. This is really intended to start to vet these issues because of their complexity, because the community is going to be interested in them. We're happy to, if there's additional questions, please ask those. This is a great time to do that. We're just looking to sort of understand where you might be challenged by some of these things, where you think there might be some opportunity, and then we can run with that from a staff perspective. And if we need more time, we'll find more time for you. Thank you.
Okay. Council discussion? Anyone?
You know, I just have one more question, Madam Mayor, of Eileen. And yeah, so Eileen, thank you again for the really great presentation. And I know that you were focused on the CDFs and the IDFs. No. See, I get that, those letters. Yes, Investment Finance District, yes. So there are other financial tools, right, that we can use. And, you know, I think of, out of Sarah Point, we have the Landscape and Lighting District. For the Northeast Ridge, we, you know, to help fund the HCP, you know, those property owners on the ridge have to pay a certain amount for habitat restoration. And so could you just kind of like layer in how those other financing tools can be helpful in the process?
Yeah, and that kind of started that. If you go back to the very beginning.
Yeah, I know you did. And it was hard for me to really understand.
Page 7, I know I kind of glossed this a lot here, so I was trying to focus it. But the other tool, there are other tools that the city has. They're not necessarily specific to the development project. So to some extent, the question, and you know, it's early enough in the entitlement process to know what other revenues might the project generate, and you know, are they expected to generate a lot of incremental sales taxes or incremental hotel taxes or some other sort of parking revenues or what have you? There are tools to leverage those other sources of revenue. They're just maybe secondary tier tools is how I would think of them. An example, the the city of Santa Cruz recently did a parking revenue bond. The city of Santa Cruz, if you've been there lately, has a lot of development happening, moving from the traditional downtown towards the beach and towards the river. And so they are, looking for funding a lot of things, and they are using I think they did a parking revenue bond. They have a parking district in the city, and they're using some of the revenues from that to help fund it's a new library, and it's a multi-purpose library and housing and everything else building. And so there's, that's an example. It's less commonly used, but it's a tool. When the city of Oakland was considering the Howard Terminal Station, they were looking at the incremental sales tax expected, the incremental hotel taxes, the incremental revenues. Those are hard to leverage directly. They're more often leveraged through the general fund.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're getting $1 million a year and we think we're going to get $2 million a year, well, we can, afford to do a lease financing that's going to leverage $1 million now. Those are the kinds of analysis that we were looking at when Oakland was considering that. Again, they're just a little bit more. They're a little more risk in the city because that's the city's debt. Then, if the revenues come in short, then the city's on the hook for that. And so that's where they're used in a secondary way. They're, once the project's up and running, maybe there's more confidence. But the city of San Francisco, even, and for Treasure Island, because that project has been delayed and the timing has come out, and the city of San Francisco is doing 3 rounds of $50 million each of general fund financing to support some of the infrastructure. That wasn't their intent up front, but for them, their housing element, like Treasure Island is a large outlet for the city of San Francisco to meet all the significant housing obligations they have. Again, those are not first tier tools, so I didn't go into those, but there are ways of kind of squeezing the lemon a little
I'm
bit
just
more.
also thinking of, like, once you build something, you want to maintain it.
Yep.
So, one of the requirements is open space, within the Baylands. And so it would be nice if there was some kind of funding structure that goes to those types of things. And so,
that's where
bringing
many
that up.
CFDs have a services component as well as an infrastructure component. To some extent, some of those services are later too. It's not just the maintaining it, but 20 years from now, it's going to need some repair, right? The level of debt. So sometimes, some of these projects are like, okay, the first X years, the special tax is for capital projects. And then at year X, it turns into a services tax, and it becomes a longer term revenue stream to the city down the line.
Would that be a reissuing of the bonds?
It wouldn't have to. No, the services taxes aren't used to pay bonds. They're used to pay ongoing costs. So that's where you sort of say, okay, we'll use this capital. We'll use the special tax for capital projects for X many years, or until all of the capital projects are reimbursed, or whatever the agreement is in the development agreement. Again, those are all negotiated terms. And then in the future, we can convert that tax capacity, that share of the taxes, and turn it into a services tax to fund down the line. And that's a way of not, retaining upfront tax capacity without cannibalizing it, but then ensuring that down the line in the future, there's a source of funding for those costs.
Yes. All right.
So there's lots of
I'm sure
those are
we'll
the things
get
we
more
think about it,
insight
and that's
as
where
we-
in sorting through the development entitlements and the financing plans, those kind of get ironed out.
Okay. Good enough.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor,
yes.
your colleague who is not here this evening
Yes.
wanted to know how much more time.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm aware. That's, I wanted to ask. Do we have discussion, or are we okay at this?
I wasn't thinking we were going to get too into discussion. I thought we were just really receiving information, but maybe we want to agendize this for a future council meeting now that we've had this presentation and tons of questions. I think I have some very high level thoughts, but nothing granular. So I have a high level reaction to this, and that's really all that I'm really equipped to respond to at this point.
Okay, because I was going to suggest that we bring this back where we have a little time to digest this, think about further questions. I think we're all going to have more questions, especially as we go along, and we may have to invite all of you back. But that's what I would recommend if we're not going to discuss further tonight. And now,
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think, you know, when I look at this, it's, I mean, there's definitely some things that need to occur
yes,
in order to, like, be intelligent with what you move forward with.
Yes.
And we are nowhere near that. So, I mean, we could bring it back, you know, fairly soon. I don't think we would really get anywhere.
no,
So,
at a later date. is what
yeah, I mean, it could
yeah.
be, you know, it could be a long time from now, potentially.
Yeah.
So, but this was excellent. And I think as the city manager said, and same with Eileen, right? You're just kind of putting it out there, giving us an understanding of just something to consider
Yes, got
potentially
it.
down the line.
Got
I
it.
think it's also cleared up some misconceptions that maybe we've had, members of the community have, about who pays for what. So I think when you have a development of this scale with the challenges that this land brings, you know, everyone's worried that they're going to be left holding the bag at the end of the day. And I feel that this presentation outlines, you know, from a financial perspective, more clearly what happens in these instances.
Yes.
So.
Terry, you have a raised hand. You're muted.
There we go. I just wanted to say that I think that until we get an idea of what the phasing and what the dollar commitments are going to be, knowing what the plans look like is one thing, and knowing what the commitment to the city is going to be is completely other. So I would say until we have a lot more information that this gets shelved.
And what financing the developer plans to bring to the table as well.
Exactly.
Their
We need
independent financing.
You're right. We need a financial plan.
Yes.
Right, to assess, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. We did some special service areas in Chicago when I was a commissioner there, and we went in with project requirements before we started having these discussions. So I think we're there, and the education on the tools tonight was just fantastic. And so I think that we've got a couple more steps we need to complete.
Yeah. Marty, Sarah, Eileen, very, very deep appreciation for your presentation. And I hope you're amenable to coming back when we ask you, probably down the road. And city manager, do you have enough direction from what we just discussed? Probably a later date, a little more specifics.
Yeah, I will follow up
banter
with
about.
each of you in our one-on-ones. And I think some of what I'll do is just get some of the questions that you don't think are necessary for the larger group. We'll start getting those answered for you. Yeah, I'm perfectly satisfied with tonight's discussion, and thank you for taking the fire hose. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. This meeting is adjourned,
Thanks.
6:03 p.m. Thank you, everyone.